In this lecture, we're going to look at the axilla and the brachial plexus. So for the axilla, which is a space between the humerus and the thoracic wall, we're going to look at its boundaries. We'll look at the walls, we'll look at its base, and we'll look at the apex of the axilla. We'll then look at the contents, the axillary artery, the axillary vein, and some axillary lymph nodes. And we'll also pay attention to the brachial plexus, which is within the axilla. We'll then look at the brachial plexus itself, we'll look at the various parts, its components, and we'll look at the anatomical relations. So the axilla is a space that's located between the humerus and the chest wall. So here we can see the humerus, and we can see in this space here, between the humerus laterally and the chest wall medially, we find the axilla. It's a pyramidal space, and most of its boundaries are formed by muscles. So the axilla would assume this space in here. Medially, we have the chest wall and serratus anterior, and laterally in this abducted arm, we'll see that the lateral boundary is the intertubercular groove of the humerus. So we're looking in this space here, and as I mentioned, it's got a lateral, a medial, an anterior, a posterior boundary, or these walls. It's got an apex and it has a base. So a pyramidal space that is below the glenohumeral joint, between the humerus and the chest wall. It provides an important passageway for vessels and nerves to pass to and from the upper limb. Structures like the axillary artery, axillary vein, and like I mentioned, the brachial plexus. The apex of the axilla is known as the cervico-axillary canal, and this is located between the neck and the axilla. So the neck being between the head and your trunk, and the axilla, cervico-axillary canal. This canal is bounded by rib 1, the clavicle, and the superior border of the scapula. So the clavicle, rib 1, and the scapula form the boundaries of this apex. The anterior wall is formed by both pectoralis major and minor, as they're running from the chest wall to the humerus and the scapula, and the posterior wall is formed by subscapularis muscle, the scapular bone, teres major, and latissimus dorsi muscle. The lateral wall is formed by the intertubercular groove of the humerus, and the medial wall is formed by the thoracic wall and serratus anterior muscles that lie on its lateral aspect. The base is the concave skin joining the upper limb to the trunk. So those auxiliary folds of skin that pass from the trunk medially to the arm laterally. You can physically hold on to these pieces of skin as they're passing from the chest wall to the upper limb. These form the base, and you can put your hand, therefore, within these folds of skin, and that is your armpit. So we can see this in a bit more detail here. So here we have the cervico-axillary canal. We've got the clavicle here. So posterior to the clavicle, we'd find the cervico-axillary canal, and that contains those structures that are passing from the neck into the axilla. We'd see rib 1 running around here, and we've got the clavicle, and then most posteriorly, we'd have the superior border of the scapula. Anteriorly, we have pectoralis minor muscle here, and here's the cut edge of pectoralis major muscle, and these are passing across towards either the humerus or the scapula. So here they're forming this anterior boundary. Posteriorly, we have these muscles here. We have subscapularis. We can also see we have teres major running down here, and we can see latissimus dorsi. So posteriorly, we have subscapularis, we have teres major, and then we have latissimus dorsi. Medially, we can see we have the intertubercular groove that's running along the humerus with the various muscles inserting into the intertubercular groove. And then medially, we see we've got these digits of serratus anterior forming the medial boundary. So anteriorly, we've got our pectoralis muscles. Posteriorly, we've got subscapularis, teres major, and latissimus dorsi. Laterally, we've got the intertubercular groove, and medially, we've got serratus anterior. Structures going to pass into the axilla via the cervico-axillary canal. Within the posterior wall of the axilla, there are a series of spaces, and these are important spaces as they allow structures to leave the axilla and pass to the various locations. So they can pass to the scapular region, they can pass to the posterior aspects of the arm, they can pass to the shoulder joint. So within the axilla, along its posterior wall, we have three spaces. These are known as the quadrangular space, the triangular space, and the triangular interval. And these spaces are formed by the muscles and sometimes the humerus that form spaces that allow structures to pass through. The origin of these structures come from deep within the axilla, which has the main contents being the axillary artery and the axillary vein. So blood vessels from the axilla can pass out to neighbouring structures through these spaces. It also contains some auxiliary lymph nodes, and it contains the brachial plexus. So nerves can also pass out through these spaces. So let's look at these spaces in a bit more detail. Here we're going to look at the quadrangular space. And the quadrangular space is important because it contains the auxiliary nerve. The auxiliary nerve, as we remember, innervates the deltoid muscle, and it's coming away from the brachial plexus, which is located within the axilla. So the auxiliary nerve comes from the brachial plexus within the axilla, and it passes out towards deltoid muscle by passing through the quadrangular space. Also coming through this space, we have the posterior humeral circumflex artery and accompanying vein, and these run around the surgical neck of the humerus. So what makes up the boundaries of this quadrangular space? Well, on the screen at the moment, we can see an anterior view of the right shoulder. So we can see the chest wall has been removed, and we can see here we've got subscapularis muscle, and then down here we can see we've got the humerus and various muscles. We can remind ourselves that we've got teres major muscle running up here. So what we can see is if we look at the quadrangular space is going to be this muscle in here, the quadrangular space. We're going to see this muscle in here. We can see that inferiorly we're going to have a muscle. Inferiorly we're going to have a muscle, and that is teres major. We can see teres major running here. We can also see that if we go medially, we can see we've got a muscle here. And this muscle is the long head of triceps. We can see that here. If we look laterally, then we can see we've actually got the humerus here. And this is going to be the surgical neck of the humerus. Superiorly, teres minor is quite difficult to see actually because subscapularis muscle is in the way. But we'd have teres minor running across in this direction. Remember, teres minor comes away from the scapula superior to teres major. So here we can see this small little space. Superiorly, we've had teres minor. Medially, we'd have the long head of triceps brachii. Inferiorly here, we'd have teres major. And laterally, we have the surgical neck of the humerus. And this is your quadrangular space. Coming through that space is going to be the auxiliary nerve and the posterior humeral circumflex artery and vein. If we move on to the next slide, we can actually see, if we just remember the quadrangular space, we can pick it up again here, and now we can see that superior boundary is teres minor. So in this posterior view of the right shoulder, again we can see superiorly now we have teres minor, inferiorly we have teres major, laterally we have the surgical neck of the humerus, and medially we have triceps brachii, the long head. And again we can see the quadrangular space. But this slide I want to talk about another space, and this space is known as the triangular space. And we can see the triangular space here. The triangular space is important as it allows the circumflex scapular vessels to pass out from the axilla and go to supply the scapular region. It has got three boundaries, that's why it's called the triangular space, and those three boundaries are superiorly teres minor, Inferiorly, teres major. And laterally, we've now got the long head of triceps again. So we can see that triceps, the long head of triceps, is forming the medial boundary of the quadrangular space, and it's forming the lateral boundary of the triangular space. The medial boundary of the quadrangular space, the lateral boundary of the triangular space. With teres minor running across superiorly for both of these spaces, and teres major running inferiorly for both of these spaces. So being aware of the musculature of the axilla, what forms its boundaries, helps us to appreciate the boundaries of these spaces. So this is the triangular space. The final space I want to talk about is known as the triangular interval. And this is important as it allows structures to pass out of the axilla and pass to the posterior compartment of the arm to supply the triceps muscles. We have the radial nerve and we have the profunda brachii artery. Now, this is slightly harder to see because the space is actually closed here. But what we can see again is superiorly, we've got teres major, and the space is actually going to sit in between the humerus and the triceps long head. So here we can see we've got triceps long head, we've got the humerus, and then superior we've got teres major. And just in this little interval, this little slit here, we find the triangular interval. And coming out of here, we have the radial nerve and the profunda brachii artery. So this is not as clear as the quadrangular and the triangular, but here, just in this little slit here, superiorly, teres major, laterally, the humerus, medially, the long head of triceps brachii, we have the triangular interval. Some very important spaces that allow structures to pass out of the axilla to the wider areas. If we look at the contents of the axilla, then the main blood vessel is the axillary artery. And the axillary artery is a direct continuation of the subclavian artery as it passes into the axilla. Here now we can clearly see the cervico-axillary canal. We can see anteriorly here we have the clavicle. We can see medially we have the first rib. And then posteriorly running along the back here, we have the superior border of the scapula. So here's the posterior boundary of the cervico-axillary canal. Here's the anterior boundary, and here's the medial boundary. And this forms the apex of the axilla, which allows the axillary artery to pass in. The axillary artery is a direct continuation of the subclavian artery as it passes into the axilla. Now, we can recognize three parts to our axillary artery, and these are associated with pectoralis minor muscle. Here we have pectoralis minor muscle coming from the ribs and passing to the coracoid process of the scapula. The first part of the axillary artery is between the clavicle and this superior border of pectoralis minor. The second part is directly deep to pectoralis minor. And the third part is from this inferior boundary of pectoralis minor all the way down to the lower border of the axilla, where the axillary artery then becomes the brachial artery. And that's typically at the inferior border of teres major. So if we have a look at the three parts of the axillary artery, then as I said, it's a direct continuation of the subclavian artery starting at the lateral border of the first rib, and it ends at the inferior border of teres major, divided into three parts. And each part gives rise to numerous blood vessels. So coming from the first part, there's going to be one. Coming from the second part, there's going to be two. And coming from the third part, there's going to be three blood vessels. So if we look at the first part of the axillary artery, this is between the clavicle and the superior border of pectoralis minor. We have one blood vessel. And we can see that here. That is the superior thoracic artery. Superior thoracic artery going to supply the superior aspect of the thoracic chest wall. If we look at the second part, which is posterior to pectoralis minor, we have two blood vessels. We have the thoracoacromial artery and the lateral thoracic. We have the thoracoacromial artery, which we can see here, and we also have the lateral thoracic artery, which we can see here. And these are the two branches that come from the second part of the axillary artery. The thoracoacromial artery is a small little root that then gives rise to a whole series of blood vessels, the acromial branch, the deltoid branch, various branches that go to supply this region. And we'll detail these more when we look at the whole blood supply to the upper limb. Within the axilla, we then have the third part of the axillary artery. Within the axilla, we then have the third part of the axillary artery, and this gives rise to three blood vessels: the subscapular artery, the anterior and posterior circumflex humeral arteries. So the subscapular artery, we can see the subscapular artery running down in this direction, and we can see that may well go on to form various anastomoses around the scapula. We can see it running up in this direction to anastomose here with a branch that's coming off the thoracoacromial artery. So a complicated anastomosis going on. And like I said, we'll come back to it. So that's one of the branches coming from the third part of the axillary artery. The remaining two branches to come off the third part are the anterior and posterior circumflex humeral arteries. Remember, the posterior circumflex passes out through the quadrangular space. It is accompanied by the axillary nerve. And these form a anastomosis around the surgical neck of the humerus. So they're the various branches of the axillary artery. Three parts, one artery coming from the first part, two arteries coming from the second, the three arteries coming from the third. So an easy way to remember those arteries. If we look at the lymph nodes, then there's a whole series of lymph nodes that are located within the axilla. I have a whole series of auxiliary lymph nodes. And these auxiliary lymph nodes are going to receive the lymphatic vessels from other neighboring lymph nodes. So for example, there are 5 groups of lymph nodes that drain into the auxiliary lymph nodes. We have pectoral lymph nodes from the anterior thoracic wall. We have subscapular lymph nodes from the posterior thoracic wall and scapula. We also have humeral lymph nodes from most of the upper limb. So most of the lymph from the upper limb are draining into these humeral lymph nodes. We have central lymph nodes, and these are beginning to receive the various lymphatic vessels from the pectoral, subscapular, and humeral. So those 3 giving rise lymphatic vessels that go to these central lymph nodes. And then from the central lymph nodes in the axilla, they're going to pass up to the apex of the axilla into apical lymph nodes. So we have these groups within the axilla that are receiving lymphatic vessels from the neighboring regions. So pectoral, subscapular, and humeral. They pass to these central lymph nodes, and the central lymph nodes then pass up into the apex of the axilla. These will then drain into subclavian lymph nodes and ultimately into the venous system. So a very basic overview there. I don't really want to get bogged down in too much of the detail, but it's important that from this whole kind of chest and upper limb region, they all pass to one central lymph node, which then passes through the axilla to the subclavian lymph nodes and ultimately draining into the venous system. Okay, so the remainder of this lecture, I want to talk about the brachial plexus. The brachial plexus is really, really important in that it provides all of the somatic innervation and also some sympathetic innervation to the upper limb. It is a network of nerves that supply the upper limb. So motor fibers to make muscles contract, sensory fibers to receive sensation, and also it carries sympathetic fibers for the sweat glands, for the erector pili muscles. Importantly, the limbs do not receive parasympathetic innervation, only receive sympathetic. The brachial plexus originates in the posterior triangle of the neck, and it passes from here to the axilla. It is formed from the anterior rami of spinal cord segments C5 through to T1. And these are known as the roots of the brachial plexus. So here we can see we've got C5, C6, C7, C8, and T1. And these are going to give rise to various branches that go on to the brachial plexus. So here we can see C5, C6, C7, C8, and T1. Okay, this one up here, we've got the C4 vertebra is coming down as C4, and then C5, C6, C7, C8, and T1. And these give rise to those nerves that go on to form the brachial plexus. And these are known as the roots of the brachial plexus. These roots pass towards the axilla by passing through a space between anterior and middle scalene muscles alongside the subclavian artery. You may not need to fully appreciate the scalene muscles, that's really part of a head and neck anatomy course, but it passes between these muscles as it heads towards the axilla. It enters the axilla like everything enters the axilla through the cervico-axillary canal alongside the subclavian artery. So here we can see some anatomical relations of the brachial plexus. And this diagram, again, is relatively complicated. It is a lateral view on the left-hand side. So this is anterior down here, and this is posterior here. This is the clavicle here, which has been removed, and this is going to be the first rib. So we can see we've got the subclavian vein here, and we can see the subclavian artery passing down alongside these structures here, which are in yellow, which are the brachial plexus. The roots pass between the anterior and middle scalene muscles. So here's anterior scalene and then middle scalene behind. So these roots are passing down through here. And here is the point where they're going to receive postganglionic sympathetic fibers via the grey rami. These are coming from the inferior and middle cervical ganglia. So these are giving rise to the sympathetic fibers that are destined for the upper limb. And this is one of the main reasons why I've actually included this diagram, just to show that this is where these fibers receive their sympathetic innervation. It's then going to enter the axilla via the cervico-axillary canal. Enter the axilla in here. Here we can see the cervico-axillary canal. Here's the first rib, and here's the cut clavicle that's been removed. So let's now just concentrate on the contents of the brachial plexus, its constituent parts. So here we can see a diagram showing the brachial plexus, and we need to go over various aspects of it. We remember the roots, C5 to T1. So here we can see the roots, C5, C6, C7, C8, and T1. These are those roots that are going to give rise to the brachial plexus. From these roots, they converge to form trunks. So we have three trunks. Three trunks are coming from these 5 brachial plexus roots. We can see we've got a superior trunk, a middle trunk, and an inferior trunk. We can see that C5 and C6 are going to join to form the superior trunk. C7 carries on without receiving anything to form the middle trunk. And C8 and T1 join to form the inferior trunk. Let's look at this in the diagram. So here we can see C5, C6, C7, C8, and T1. We can see C5 and C6 join to form the superior trunk. So C5 here and C6 join to form the superior trunk. C7, which is here, carries on to form the middle trunk. We then see C8 and T1. These two join to form the inferior trunk. And these are all above the clavicle. We call this the supraclavicular part of the brachial plexus because it's above the clavicle. C5 C6 form the superior trunk, C7 forms the middle trunk, C8, T1 forms the inferior trunk. We've gone from 5 roots down to 3 trunks. This is all between the neck and the cervico-auxiliary canal. We're still above the clavicle. If we go back, we can now see that each of these trunks gives rise to an anterior and posterior division. It happens as we pass through the cervico-auxiliary canal. So as we pass through the cervico-auxiliary canal, these trunks, each one of them, is dividing into an anterior and to a posterior division. The anterior divisions are going to give rise to fibers that supply the flexor compartments of the upper limb. And these flexor compartments sit anteriorly. The posterior divisions are going to give rise to branches that supply the extensor compartments. And the extensor compartments are within the posterior aspect of the upper limb. So each of these trunks is going to give rise to an anterior and to a posterior division. And this is happening as they pass through the cervico-auxiliary canal. So let's have a look. We can see we've got the superior trunk here, and that is giving rise to an anterior division here. See here, the superior trunk is dividing into an anterior division. We can see it's also dividing into a posterior division. That's going down here. If we look at the middle trunk is giving rise to an anterior division. And this anterior division of the middle trunk is going to unite with the anterior division of the superior trunk. So let's do that again. Superior trunk here gives rise to an anterior division, and that anterior division is joined by the anterior division of the middle trunk. So these two anterior divisions join. If we look at the posterior division of the superior trunk, that joins with the posterior division of the middle trunk. We can see that down here. We can also notice that it receives the posterior division of this inferior trunk. So we can now see that the posterior division of the inferior trunk is joining the posterior divisions of the middle and of the superior trunk. So all 3 posterior divisions from the superior, middle, and inferior trunks join. The anterior divisions of the superior and middle trunk join, and the anterior division we can see here runs down without running towards anything. It doesn't attach to other anterior divisions from the various trunks. That stays on its own. Anterior division from superior trunk and from the middle trunk unite. Anterior division from the inferior trunk carries on. The posterior divisions from the superior, middle, and inferior trunks unite together. What this results in is a series of chords. The divisions coming from the trunks form 3 chords. So the anterior divisions of the superior and middle trunks form the lateral chord. The anterior division of the inferior trunk forms the medial chord. The posterior division from all 3 trunks form the posterior chord. These chords are named according to their position relative to the second part of the auxiliary artery. So let's have a look at this in the diagram. We can now see we've gone from 5 roots, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, down to 3 trunks, superior, middle, inferior. Each one of those trunks gave rise to 2 divisions, an anterior and a posterior. And now, where the anterior divisions here have formed, they have formed this one. That is going to be known as your lateral chord. Here, the direct continuation of the posterior divisions is known as your posterior cord, and here the continuation of the anterior division from the inferior trunk is known as the medial cord. And we can see with the axillary artery here, we have lateral to the axillary artery, the lateral cord, posterior to the axillary artery, the posterior cord, and medial to the axillary artery, the medial cord. Now these three cords, lateral, medial, and posterior, are going to give rise to the terminal nerves of the brachial plexus. The terminal nerves of the brachial plexus, specifically the musculocutaneous, the median, the axillary, the radial, and the ulnar. We have three cords of the brachial plexus, giving rise to a series of terminal branches. If we go back to the previous slide, we can now see here we have the lateral cord that is going to split into two. It splits into two. One of them is the musculocutaneous. The other one joins with the splitting of the medial cord to form the median nerve. So we've got the musculocutaneous, direct continuation of the lateral cord. We also have a union from the lateral cord and the medial cord to form the median nerve. And we have a direct continuation of the medial cord being the ulnar nerve. And this forms a very nice M shape arrangement. We can see we've got this M here. And this is characteristic of the terminal branches of the brachial plexus, where the two cords, the lateral and the medial cord, give rise to three terminal branches: musculocutaneous, median, and ulnar. The posterior cord splits into two, a large one and a small one. This is posterior to the axillary artery. It gives rise to the axillary nerve that passes out of the axilla via the quadrangular space, and the radial nerve, which also passes out of the axilla via the triangular space. So we have these two coming from the posterior cord. And that gives us 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 terminal branches. So here we can see those terminal branches in a bit more anatomical detail. This is an anterior arm. It's the right arm. And we can see the lateral cord here. We can see the medial cord here. And we can see the posterior cord, which has been pulled out from underneath the axillary artery, so we can see the axillary nerve passing out through here. But we can see this nice characteristic M shape again. So we've got musculocutaneous nerve here, we've got the median nerve here, and we've got the ulnar nerve passing down here. Here we can see from the posterior cord, we've got the axillary nerve, and we've got the radial nerve. So these 5 terminal branches coming from the brachial plexus. So in this lecture, we've looked at the boundaries of the brachial plexus, we've looked at the walls, we've looked at the base, we've looked at the apex. We've then looked at the contents of the brachial plexus, the axillary artery, its parts and some named branches. We looked at the axillary vein quite briefly, looked at the axillary lymph nodes and some named lymph nodes, and then we looked finally at the brachial plexus.